Hello, and welcome to this webinar entitled Helping Our Neighbors Weather the Storm. My name is Christine Duffy, and I am the Disaster Response Supervisor with Lutheran Social Services. In partnership with the Bishop and the South Dakota ELCA Synod, we've put together this short webinar to provide you some resources to use to support our neighbors through difficult times. I'm very excited to be here with you today to share some of the ways to be a compassionate presence and connect with those who may be struggling with their mental health. Thank you for taking the time today to be part of this webinar. I wanted to start with a little background as to the purpose and the idea behind our partnership and the information shared today. As you are aware, South Dakotans have certainly weathered many storms in recent years, from widespread floods and tornadoes to empty fields and smaller harvests, and now a global pandemic. And though we tend to have a self-reliant mentality here in the Great Plains, in reality, the compounding stress of multiple disasters is putting a strain on our mental health. People all across South Dakota are facing challenges unlike any they have ever experienced and are struggling with emotions like anxiety, depression, stress, sadness, and fear. We're also seeing increasing rates of depression, of substance abuse, PTSD, and suicide. And unfortunately, the mental health system in the United States is underprepared to handle this surge. In the fall of last year, the Bishop and LSS sat down together to discuss strategies on how to help our communities recover from disaster, particularly those in the more rural areas and those struggling with farm stress. Out of these talks came an idea to collect practical and accessible ways to provide emotional and spiritual care and share those resources with rostered staff and lay leaders across the state to reach out to those who are facing struggles, whether they live next door or sit right next to us in the pew. With COVID forcing many of us to practice social distancing and consequently be more isolated, COVID is a poignant reminder just of how important mental health is to the wellness of our communities. This webinar is an opportunity for us to share this resource with you and hopefully add another tool in your toolbox. Before we dive into psychological first aid, I want to just take a second to acknowledge a couple of things. First is that the material we'll discuss today is the work of many knowledgeable organizations such as the National Center for PTSD, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the World Health Organization, and Johns Hopkins University, among others. I mention this to recognize the work that these organizations are doing in regards to mental health, and also to highlight that there are many additional resources out there for you to explore and utilize. Secondly, since psychological first aid encompasses so many of the skills that you will already be familiar with, and most likely you're currently using, this webinar is meant to be more of a high-level overview or a refresher to psychological first aid rather than a comprehensive training. But for those of you who are new to psychological first aid and these skills, hopefully this will encourage you to explore the free resources and additional information to learn more about psychological first aid. We've provided some resources at the end of this webinar. And for those of you who have worked with psychological first aid before, hopefully the next 20 minutes or so will be a review of some of the current skills or a refresher on some new skills that may have been forgotten. Now, with that background, let's jump into this introduction of psychological first aid. For our learning objectives today, we've kept them pretty simple with just 3. Understand the goals and purpose of psychological first aid, recognize the basic principles that guide actions, and integrate the core actions of look, listen, and link into our ministries. So what is psychological first aid? And how is it used? Well, psychological first aid, or PFA, is an evidence-informed approach that is built on the concept of human resilience. Psychological first aid aims to reduce stress symptoms and assist in a healthy recovery following a traumatic event, natural disaster, public health emergency, or even a personal crisis. It was developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD, with contributions from individuals involved in disaster research and response. Now, the overall goal of psychological first aid is to help people feel safe, hopeful, calm, and connected to others, connect them to social, physical, and emotional support systems, and help them regain a sense of control through self-efficacy and empowerment. Now, I really want to stress that psychological first aid is not counseling or a therapy, but rather it's a short-term intervention focused on providing practical support following traumatic events. Some great reasons to use psychological first aid is that it is consistent with research and evidence on risk and resilience following trauma. It's applicable and practical in a multitude of field settings. It's appropriate for developmental levels across the lifespan. It can be used with kids, families, older adults, and it is culturally informed and delivered in a flexible manner. We as providers can adapt this intervention to meet the needs of whomever we work with, whether that ministry is in rural farming communities or in the suburbs. Now, if you've ever been trained in mental health first aid or other crises interventions, you may recognize some similar principles and skills in psychological first aid. However, mental health first aid has a much wider focus, which includes the full range of developing mental disorders and crisis, while PFA is solely focused on use following traumatic events. It was originally developed to be implemented after a disaster, such as a flood or a tornado, a mass violence event like a terrorist attack, or one-on-one after a traumatic incident like a car accident. And though COVID-19 pandemic and farming stress are less tangible forms of disasters, countless individuals are still affected and they may benefit from psychological first aid interventions. Now, some modifications will be needed to adapt the traditional face-to-face approach of PFA to accommodate for social distancing, and we'll discuss some of those changes in a little bit later. Now, an important thing to note is that after a trauma or disaster, not everyone who has been affected will need psychological first aid. And the same can be said for regular first aid. Not everyone will need medical treatment after an accident. However, just as first aid is used to reduce physical discomfort due to a bodily injury, psychological first aid is a strategy to reduce the painful range of emotions and responses experienced by people exposed to high stress. Emotional distress may not always be as visible as a physical injury, but it is just as painful and debilitating. And though the word psychological is in the name, again, I really want to stress psychological first aid is not counseling or therapy. It does not assume that everyone is going to develop severe mental health problems or long-term difficulties. However, the evidence shows us that using PFA has psychological benefits when administered after a traumatic experience. We understand that those affected by such events will experience a broad range of early reactions, and some of these reactions may cause enough distress to interfere with adaptive coping, and their recovery may be helped by support from caring disaster responders. And that's another great aspect about psychological first aid. You don't have to be a psychiatrist or have an advanced degree to administer it. Just as you don't have to be a doctor to administer first aid. Anyone can provide psychological first aid. Our role as a helper in psychological first aid is to support people by being a compassionate presence for someone experiencing trauma, providing practical assistance in that moment and connecting them to a higher level of care if needed. So let's briefly summarize what psychological first aid is and what it is not before we move on to the principles. Well, psychological first aid is not something that only professionals do. And again, it's not counseling or therapy. We won't be pressuring details of the event or for them to analyze what happened. It's not about forcing people to share their feelings and reactions or debrief after an event. We're not the superheroes coming in to save the day to solve all of their problems. Our role is to provide non-intrusive, practical care and support. We'll assess their needs and concerns, but not label or diagnose them. We'll use active listening skills to comfort people and promote a sense of calm, opening up a safe space where they can begin the recovery process. We will also help them address their basic needs and access to services and supports by actively listening to their concerns and their priorities. We're not telling them what we think they need. For someone to regain control of their lives, they need to be able to make their own decisions and take responsibility for their own recovery. Which leads us to our 5 basic principles of psychological first aid. It is about creating and promoting a sense of safety, calm and comfort, connectedness, hope, and self-empowerment for the individual. And there are no new skills needed to learn to do this. We already have these skills. And to show you, I want to take a moment to think of a recent interaction you've had with a client, a coworker, or even a loved one. In that interaction, what did you do to promote that person's safety? How did you convey a sense of calm or connectedness? Were you able to instill hope in them? And if so, how? How were you able to build on their sense of community and sense of self-efficacy? The skills you use in your daily interactions are the same skills you use in psychological first aid. Now, I know I said that this would be a high-level overview, but I want to take just a moment and get a bit technical here and explain how these 5 principles relate to some psychological theory. So if you have studied any psychology, you may have come across a guy named Maslow and his theory of mental health that's predicated on fulfilling innate human needs in priority, culminating in self-actualization. And that's a whole lot of fancy words that mean Maslow believed that the reason people behave the way they do is because they are trying to fill a need, and in order to grow as a person, all of our needs must be met. So he categorized human needs into 5 tiers, and starting from the bottom, those needs are physiological needs. These are the biological requirements for human survival, air, food, drink, shelter, sleep, all of those. And these are the most important and most primal of needs. If these needs are not satisfied, the human body cannot function well. All other needs become secondary until these needs are met. Now, once a person's individual physiological needs are more or less satisfied, the needs for safety and security will become principal. People in general want to experience order, predictability, and control in their lives. Once those are met, the 3rd level of human needs is social, and it involves feelings of belongingness. The need for interpersonal relationships will motivate our behavior. Connections to others, having friends, intimacy, a family. The 4th level, esteem needs, are next, and those can be classified into 2 categories: esteem for oneself and the desire for reputation or respect from others. And the final tier, the self-actualization needs, refer to the realization of a person's potential, their self-fulfillment, seeking personal growth, and their peak experiences. Essentially, it's the need to be the best person that we can be. Now, according to Maslow, one couldn't move up the pyramid to focus on higher level needs until the levels below are satiated. Consequently, our behavior and focus change as the needs are met or go unfulfilled or lost. So, to bring all of this back to psychological first aid, I want to highlight that the 5 principles of safety, calm and comfort, connectedness, hope, and self empowerment all closely match up to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so, as we promote these 5 principles in psychological first aid, we are helping that individual fulfill their needs and allow them to move up the pyramid for growth and recovery. Consider a person's needs after a disaster, like such as a tornado. There will be a need for shelter, for water, security, maybe trying to find their loved ones, and so on. All of those needs are those lower levels. We drop back down to the bottom. After any kind of trauma, often the first question asked is, what am I going to do? Well, for someone experiencing disaster, it's hard to even think about what the next step is because they haven't fulfilled those basic needs. I mean, how can you focus on processing emotions when you don't even know where you will sleep that night? So it's our job is to support the individual as they work to meet those basic needs and move through the pyramid and the human needs to focus their attention on mental health and recovery. And we're seeing this right now with the COVID crisis. If you've worked with anyone, you know that many individuals are still focused on those bottom core needs. You know, they've lost their job or hours. You know, they're struggling with income and to put food on the table. They're having trouble paying their rent or their mortgage. And many of them are feeling so isolated and disconnected because we physically can't be together. Can you really expect people to focus on their mental health when they're worried about their next meal or how they'll pay for their children's home and clothing for children? So our question now becomes, what should our ministry look like during and post-COVID? And how can we bring these 5 principles into the work that we do to help our neighbors weather this storm? And that leads us to the core actions of psychological first aid. Prepare, look, listen, and link. Pretty simple, huh? It's almost an instinctual thing for helpers in times of chaos to look for who needs support, listen to what they need, and link them to additional assistance. Really, psychological first aid is just an organized way to coordinate that natural impulse we have to help. But before we jump in and start looking and listening, we need to prepare ourselves for our role both personally and professionally. You've probably heard the saying before, well prepared is half done. Well, professionally, we need to learn about the situation, identify any safety concerns, and know which support services are available and where to find them. Personally, we need to consider our own health, and again, both physical and psychological, to prepare and make an honest decision about whether we are ready to help at this particular time. Now, often, traditional face-to-face psychological first aid is done in community settings such as a school or shelters or even emergency rooms, where we as a helper would be coming into the situation following an incident or an accident and providing this help. However, COVID has made collective gathering pretty challenging sometimes, so we have to plan for a different approach in a different situation. So the first thing we'll want to consider are communication methods. Before, where we may have walked right up to a distressed individual and began a conversation, how will that look now that we can't gather? Will this be face-to-face still, or is this a virtual interaction? And how will we introduce ourselves? Is this a cold call, or do we already have a rapport built with them? And when we consider privacy concerns, how do we ensure that a phone call or a video meeting stays confidential? Since we're all working at home, we've had to struggle with technology and differences. And how, are we able to have a space where no one is going to burst in mid-session with, kids asking for food or wanting to play? Just how do you keep those sessions confidential and private? Another thing we'll want to do is to gather and organize relevant information to have at hand ready to share with individuals. Things like up-to-date information about COVID and the symptoms to look for and how a person can get help are some great things to have right away. It's also important to understand what some of the myths and the rumors going around relating to COVID are to ensure that we are providing accurate information. We'll also want to know what services, supports, and resources are in our area that individuals can access for additional help. Right now, based on what's going on with housing issues, food insecurity, we may want to know some places that help with rent or mortgage payments or utility payments, maybe food pantries, or even unemployment services. Having a few places ready to go will be incredibly helpful when we begin to link the individuals with services and assistance. It's a lot easier to say, hey, here's this great resource. Since you're telling me you're struggling putting food on the table, let's talk about it right now, rather than saying, oh, let me get back to you. I'm not sure about that. But we are not human Google, so it's okay if you don't know everything, but it will instill a sense of safety and security for individuals, even when we don't know the answer, to say, I don't know, but I will try and find out for you. Now, once we are prepared and ready to go, we are going to move on to the next action, look. However, today it might be more appropriate to refer to this step as engage rather than look, as we're not really physically looking around the crowd for distressed individuals as we would after other types of disasters. Before, contact might have been as simple as walking up to someone and saying, hi, my name is Christine and I work with LSS. I'm checking in with people to see how they're doing and to see if I can help in any way. Is it okay if I talk to you for a few minutes? Before we talk, is there something right now that you need, like some water or fruit juice? So in COVID world, what we have to do is consider, how do we engage individuals when we're not gathered together physically? How do we identify and connect with those vulnerable populations? Who will we approach, and how can we establish trust and build rapport with these individuals in our communities? If it's someone we've worked with before, how do you reestablish that connection when you're physically separated? So as we begin engaging with individuals, listening will be the most important skill we can have as helpers. And by listening, we are telling the person that they are valuable and that they matter. Listening can create an opportunity for them to express their emotions without judgment, which may help them feel calmer. I don't know about you, but sometimes I just need to vent everything I'm thinking and I'm feeling, and then afterwards I feel so much better. It's not even really about the fixing of things. It's just sometimes you need that ear to listen to you or that shoulder to cry on. And as we are listening, we should be honest and trustworthy. We need to respect a person's right to make their own decision, which is a part of the principle for self-empowerment. We should make it clear to people that even if they refuse help now, that they can still access help in the future. And of course, respect privacy and keep a person's story confidential. And acknowledge and validate how they are feeling. We don't necessarily have to agree with their feelings, and we shouldn't try to commiserate them or tell them about all the times that you've gone through things like this. We're going to use empathy rather than sympathy. We may say something like, "I'm so sorry. I can imagine this is very sad for you." Or, "Given what's going on, that sounds like a normal response." When we listen to that person sharing, we can understand what that person's urgent needs and concerns are because we are hearing it directly from them. It's also a chance for us to evaluate if that person needs ongoing assistance and should be referred to a higher level of service. Our fourth and final core action is link. And this is where we are linking people to that practical support and helping them address their basic needs, access services, and affirm their ability to cope with the current situation. Social supports are one of the best predictors of future resilience. As helpers, we can use our role to help people identify those social support systems, and we can encourage them to find ways to stay connected to them despite physical distance. We should remember that all people have the resources to cope, so we need to empower the individual to use their own coping resources and strengths to assist in their recovery. Ask what has helped them in the past to cope with situations. Maybe brainstorm some ideas. Maybe it's taking walks in the morning to clear their head, or relaxing, listening to music. We don't have to come up with this new innovative strategy for coping. We can use the ones we already know. And of course, while we're linking, we don't want to forget to promote self-empowerment by working with them to come up with the practical solutions. Now, I know often the types of individuals that we work with have many needs, and we understand that we can't do or fulfill many of the things they need. But what we can focus on is what we can assist with. Maybe that's getting them some food or helping them make a call. Maybe it's making referrals to other places that can help them. Remember all that work that we did during the preparations stage? Well, this is where it pays off. We have a lot of information ready and can provide that information for them at that moment that they need. By using the principles of psychological first aid and listening, linking, and looking, we can help our neighbors all around us help recover and be healthy. And so once again, I want to thank you for joining us today to learn more about psychological first aid. And we've included a list of mental health resources that you can refer those you work with for additional help. Lutheran Social Services has some funding available through Lutheran Disaster Response for rural and farm stress counseling, and through the South Dakota Community Foundation for COVID-19 stress financing. So this would help with co-pays, deductibles, maybe even cover the costs if there are no other resources available. And they can call that phone number on the screen to set up an appointment. Avera also has a farm and rural stress hotline that's available 24 hours a day that they can call and be linked to additional mental health resources. Of course, you can always call the Helpline Center at 211 to be directed to different resources. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline, you can call 24 hours a day. You can also text the word HOME to 741-741 to get assistance. South Dakota does have a Farm Aid hotline, and also the Department of Social Services Community Behavioral Health has a great list of the different mental health resources in the state. Also, to learn more about psychological first aid and other disaster mental health resources, check out these suggested resources.